Greetings from Reno, Nevada, where I'm joining you for this conference. I'm very pleased and honored to have my research included in the papers that are being presented today, and I'm only sorry I can't be with all my colleagues and join you in person. The topic I'm talking about today is part of my ongoing research on World War II and the Cold War, and deals with competing Hungarian emigre organizations in America 1941 to 1945. The two competing emigre perspectives in their organizations I will be discussing today, the Council of Ministers and its real and philosophical opposition led by Rustem Bamberry, were officially organized in the West in 1944. However, their planning stages began years earlier, and it is important to review how and why these organizations were initiated and what their missions were. It's also important to understand how emigre Hungarian statesmen Tibor Eckhart's early wartime activities in the West influenced the establishment of both of the organizations that were formed in 1944. On his arrival in New York, he founded the short-lived 1941-42 Movement for Independent Hungary. The Movement for Independent Hungary is established with the support of the U.S. government on Tibor Eckhart's return to the U.S. after Eckhart was encouraged to come back following a 1940 trip in which he met with President Franklin Roosevelt and expressed the Horthy government's desire to align itself with the Allies or remain neutral in the European conflict. A desire that was ultimately virtually impossible to achieve given the trajectory of the conflict on the continent. Immediately after the formation of the movement, a vicious international propaganda campaign against the organization, led by USSR's political allies such as Rustem Bamberry, Michael Kádár, and the Czech government in exile, as well as the fact that with the war's progression and Hungary's declaration of war against the U.S. on December 13, 1941, which put Hungary firmly into the Nazi Germany's camp, the movement was doomed to failure. However, Hungarian leaders in America and elsewhere in the West were unwilling to abandon the idea of forming a strong Hungarian exile organization that would provide leadership after the war's end and planning for future options. Key stakeholders, particularly Hungary's professional diplomats abroad, continued to discuss and plan an organization that would assume a prominent role in the development of post-war Hungary. This faction eventually formed the Council of Ministers, the Követi Bizottság. On the other side, the Hungarian political opposition in exile, spearheaded by Bamberry, saw the turmoil of the war years as an opportunity to seize power after the war and eradicate the conservative and pro-Horthy factions that had dominated in Hungary earlier in the 20th century. This talk will introduce the leaders, mission, and supporters of these two major Hungarian emigre groups that were operating before and during the critical period of 1944. John Pállényi, in his final and most important posting, served as Royal Hungarian American Minister to the United States from 1933 until Hungary entered an alliance with Germany on the 22nd of November 1940. That day, Pállényi notified Count Pál-Teleki that he was resigning his post, but he continued to enjoy significant access to key U.S. government decision makers. In a letter to his good friend Tibor Eckhart explaining his decision to resign, Pállényi said, unquote, quote, "If a clear-cut issue arises, one has to take a stand. One has to be one thing or another. One cannot be a straddler," unquote. Pállényi acknowledged to Eckhart that if he stayed at his post, he would lose his credibility with the contact he had built so carefully, and thus the possibility to be of future use to Hungary and the Hungarian cause. In 1942, almost immediately after realizing the movement for independent Hungary was not going to succeed as Eckhart had had to resign under pressure, and finding the situation in Hungary more critical by the moment, former Minister Pállényi and other Hungarian diplomats and leaders began to talk about forming a group of leaders to encourage and support resistance in Hungary and to prepare for the post-war period. Pállényi provided a primary source of vital information and contacts. It was not until the 3rd of April 1944 that key emigre figures led in Europe by the Dean of Hungarian Ministers, György Bárca, and by John Pállényi in the United States, agreed in strictest confidence to form a committee of ministers. Bárca, the former Hungarian minister in London, had been corresponding with key Hungarian diplomats since the previous spring about forming a diplomats committee. Although Pállényi played a key role in the organization in the United States in securing support for the committee of ministers, there is no question that the primary leadership of the organization remained in the hands of György Bárca, who was referred to as the rangidős elnök, or the doyen of the group. In the spring of 1944, Barca reached out to the British and United States ministers to Switzerland, Sir Clifford Norton and Leland B. Harrison, respectively, to inform them of the formation of the Committee of Ministers and its mission. He assured them that the intent of the committee was not to engage in internal politics, but simply to serve the interests of a democratic Hungary. Barca also contacted the other legations to inform the committee's formation, as well as communicating with all the key Hungarian diplomats who resigned no later than March 12, 1944, when Hungary was occupied by the German army, to join the organization. After Hungary's occupation by Nazi Germany, Barca communicated with ministers Norton and Harrison to inform them that not only was Hungary completely controlled, occupied, and terrorized by the Germans, but it would be virtually impossible for the Hungarians to break free of the German yoke. He asked that his report be passed on to Soviet authorities as well as to the Vatican, and asked that the Pope be informed of the conditions of the German occupation. In a May 1944 letter to Pályányi, Baron György Makács Bessenyei, Hungarian minister to Switzerland until his resignation on the 24th of March 1944, described the committee's composition and mission. A committee comprising all ministers and heads of missions who have not recognized the Stolyai government will undertake to group those Hungarian diplomats, employees, and other patriots who may be relied on, and to function as suits the occasion as an advisory and informatory organization relative to any matters concerning Hungary for the United States, Great Britain, and the Allied nations generally. The committee will seek to promote the organization of civil and military resistance to the German in Hungary. The committee represents no political party and assumes no standpoint regarding matters of internal policy, but its persistent aim is the reestablishment of Hungarian sovereignty and independence based on constitutional democracy. Unquote. On 18 May 1944, as the new committee, to be known as the Council of Ministers of Követi Bizottság, was being formulated, Pályányi received a call at Dartmouth from Howard Travers of the U.S. State Department, who wanted to stop by the next day. Thinking it must be in reference to gaining admission to Dartmouth for his son, Pályányi was surprised when Travers said he was coming to me on official business by order of his superiors. The message Travers brought was in code and first had to be transcribed. According to Pályányi's notes, the gist of the message was that while the department could not recognize my committee, it looked with favor on the proposed activities and was therefore ready to facilitate the intercourse between the Hungarians in question, including all cable expense, provided it went through the U.S. Department of State. Travers also said the state was trying to get in touch with Count István Bethlen. The matter was thoroughly discussed, and Pályányi noted that Travers immediately realized that certain elements would attack anyone figuring and supporting this Hungarian movement, and I would lose all usefulness in case of publicity. Pályányi accepted the proposed arrangement with the State Department, but also told Travers that the President of the United States would have to approve it, as he, Pályányi, had pledged when he resigned as minister in 1940 to consult with the President before engaging in any kind of political activity. That day, Pályányi drafted his statement of intent for the new organization, and as per his request, sent it to Travers at the State Department, where it was approved by his superiors. Though Hungary was officially an Axis state, it was widely known that the Hungarians had made several diplomatic attempts to remove themselves from the German side as the war progressed. Pályányi was a valuable conduit for updated information. For example, he received a confidential letter from Hungary in May 1943 from former Prime Minister István Bethlen, with whom he and Eckhart had been corresponding regularly, thanking him for his insights and advice and providing a status report on the resistance movement within Hungary. I quote, "We could give considerable practical help to promote Anglo-Saxon occupation, and several instruments for this purpose have already been created. I can inform you that we have organized groups all over the country, which at the approach of Anglo-Saxon troops are instructed to give them all assistance. On the other hand, it is clear that due to our geographic position, we cannot initiate any action before the approach of the troops of occupation. Premature or ill-advised action on our part might even retard the Allied military action. For the time being, we will keep our railroads, bridges, and roads prepared for all eventualities, awaiting the future approach of Allied divisions." Unquote. Bethlen goes on to observe in the letter that the only roadblocks to cooperation with the Allies could come from the Hungarian-German minority, which had been heavily armed by the Germans and the Romanians. The letter also makes the point, quote, that the Hungarian Revisionist League is destined to play an important role in Hungary. Since you left, it has built up an efficient organization in every community of the country and is today the strongest organization. The Boy Scouts organization has merged into the Revisionist League as it refused to join the Hitler Youth in Vienna as the Germans had requested, unquote. The writer closes with a request that Pellini send further news. Clearly, in the early 1943, Hungarians in Hungary still held hope they could escape being crushed between the Germans and Russians in the coming battle on their soil. Thus, throughout 1943, a faint hope had remained that the Hungarians could control the situation. The Germans had, for example, not taken over the major government agencies, thus leaving open certain possibilities for the future. The dissident diplomats who formed the Council of Ministers were the leaders in whom the hard-pressed Hungarian put its greatest faith, for they were those most aware of the untenable situation in which their country found itself. However, when the Nazi puppet government was installed in March 1944, it set about implementing German policies of ethnic cleansing that the Horthy government had succeeded in putting off, and this, coupled with the progress of the war, made Hungary's situation even more untenable. The Revisionist League that was active in Hungary still indicated to the leaders of the Council of Ministers that its members were hopeful that they could take some steps to avoid the apparently inevitable disaster. But by the fall of 1944, the leaders of all the anti-Nazi parties in Hungary had been dragged to Germany. A letter to George Barca from the Hungarian legation in Rome dated 19 September 1944 stated that these leaders represent the totality of anti-Nazi organization and in any case represent the overwhelming majority of the country, unquote. During the last chaotic months of World War II, Barca and the leadership of the Committee of Ministers made a heroic effort to serve the interests of the beleaguered Hungarian nation. Under Besenyei's leadership in Switzerland, an aid organization was established that provided assistance to Hungarian students as well as to Hungarian refugees. In the United States, American Hungarian Relief was formed to ship medical supplies and medicines purchased in Switzerland to Hungary. Working with the International Red Cross, George Gica, the former Hungarian minister to the U.S., arranged for the U.S. to fly $250,000 worth of medical aid into Budapest. These are a few of the accomplishments of what the Committee of Ministers was able to achieve during its brief existence. We can see that in the United States, once formed, the Council of Ministers had unofficial support and even some financial assistance from the government. The key contact at the State Department was Howard Travers, and Tibor Eckhart was his conduit and chief source of information regarding both the Council of Ministers' efforts and the other national and international events with respect to Hungary. Why then did the United States nor Great Britain support the Council's efforts publicly nor provide more assistance? Perhaps the answer lay in the disinformation being dispensed by an immigrant group with a completely different agenda for Hungary's future. What the dissident Hungarian diplomats sought was to preserve the Hungarian political status quo after the war. They sought it first through Eckhart's Free Hungary movement, and when that failed, through the Committee of Ministers. Another group of Hungarian emigres and their supporters were working at cross purposes to this goal, were principally Czechoslovak leader Eduard Beneš and Rustem Bamberry. Until their deaths, these two leading power brokers in the movement for post-war change in Hungary formed a powerful opposition to the established Hungarian leadership. Bamberry was convinced that every evil that had befallen Hungary was a result of the Horthy Regency's reactionary leadership and the perpetuation of the rights of the nobility and the petty nobility. He was intractable on this issue. Bamberry had arrived in the United States in 1938, having recognized the path that Hungary was taking by allying itself with Germany and having anticipated even greater political upheaval in Europe in the future. Already elderly, Bamberry was a controversial figure with prodigious intellectual powers, a small but vocal left-wing political base, a rigid view of Hungary and Hungarian politics, and a definite political agenda. He soon settled into a teaching position at the New School for Social Research in New York City and continued his activities as an influential force against the Horthy regime. He wrote for left-wing publications, such as The Nation, lobbied for political change in Hungary and in the Danubian Basin, and tried to influence American foreign policy through his network of colleagues on the left. It is not difficult to understand why Vanberg was highly regarded for his scholarship in the field of criminal law, or why his left-wing views found public support in America during this period of time. He exerted a disproportionate influence as a result of his prolific writing and networking, especially in some university and intellectual circles, as the communist cause and its political ideology had a substantial number of supporters in the English-speaking world, particularly in England and the United States. On the other hand, Vanberg had little support within the Hungarian immigrant community, except in communist and socialist circles, and even they were suspicious of his elitist background, as articles about him in the communist newspaper Magyar readily demonstrate. Anticipating Tibor Eckhart, the Hungarian government's unofficial representative to the United States, returned to America in 1941, Vanberg wanted to form his own group in order to count Eckhart's potential impact. Vanberg and the newly arrived Laszlo Fenyes founded the American Federation of Democratic Hungarians, Demokratikus Magyarok Amerikai Szövetsége, on the 6th of June, 1941. The leadership of the Vanberg organization was composed not just of Hungarians, but also other ethnic minorities representing potential members of a greater Danubian Federation. There is no question that originally the organization was formed in order to neutralize Eckhart and sabotage his work. 2 months before Eckhart arrived in the United States, Vanberg wrote to the Czechoslovak Minister of Foreign Affairs in London, Jan Masaryk, to request Czech financial support for a proposed fortnightly publication espousing their point of view. In the letter, he attempts to frighten Masaryk into thinking that if Eckhart were successful in the U.S., it would threaten the Czechoslovak cause and support revisionism. It is interesting that Vanberg felt the need to discredit the support that he anticipated Eckhart would receive from the Hungarian-American community upon his arrival in the United States. The letter also reveals that Vanberg realized that the majority of Hungarian-Americans would be politically more in sync with Eckhart's vision for Hungary's future than with his own. It does not seem to have entered into Vanberg's analysis that the Hungarian Americans in question were long-term U.S. residents, the majority of them second generation, whose political decisions were quite free of any direct influence from the reactionary Horthy regime. More than in any of his other writings, Vanberg's private and confidential to Masaryk reveals his fears, and I quote, "Our propaganda seems all the more important as the Hungarian government is making an effort through their emissary, Dr. Eckhart, using American revisionist organizations to establish a pseudo-exiled Hungarian government, which would secure, in case of an Allied victory, the continuation of the post-war reactionary regime in Hungary. These efforts would find powerful support in the major part of the Magyar newspapers published in this country. It seems to us, therefore, of greatest importance to establish a literary foothold in support of our democratic, liberal, and progressive movement," unquote. Vanberg requested $1,000 a month from Masaryk to support the publication he had in mind, and then closed with the sentiment that if Masaryk was kind enough to share his views, he would appreciate his taking up the matter with the Czechoslovak Foreign Office and the Ministry of Propaganda. Subsequently, Hart's, an anti-fascist paper, was funded and began publishing scathing criticism of Eckhart, the Free Hungary movement, and American support of it. Vanberg did, however, become the darling of America's left-wing socialist and communist intellectual press. In the West, however, Vanberg portrayed himself as a Democrat and the spokesperson for the oppressed Hungarian population as a whole, not as a supporter of special interests such as the legal defense of Communist Party activists. Even Oskar Jászai admitted that Vanberg had very little official support in America, characterizing his situation there as, quote, "living in noble poverty and unaided by the mighties of the land who favored the Habsburgs and hidden exponents of the Horthy system," unquote. Vanberg and his like-minded colleagues were motivated by the belief that Hungarians could only be freed from oppression by their ruling classes by means of a dramatic break with the past and its leaders. They felt that in the future, Hungary could only survive as a democratic nation that was part of a Danubian federation to which all successor states of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire would belong. Needless to say, using the Jászai model, the government would be free of any leaders from the Horthy years. Oskar Jászai was viewed as the great champion of this vision, and it formed the basis of his and Banbury's collaboration over several decades. Banbury and his supporters had much in common with the political ideology espoused by the leadership of the successor states, particularly with Czechoslovakia's Edvard Beneš. An adroit politician, Beneš straddled the political fence so cleverly he was held in favor both at Whitehall and at the Kremlin. The Hungarian political establishment, in the persons of Eckhart and Pellini, warned the United States that Beneš was, so to speak, in Stalin's pocket. Interestingly, scholars now dealing with previously secret archival material from the former Soviet Union revealed through the Venona files, which were released starting in 1985, have become convinced that the long-held Hungarian belief that Beneš was a Soviet agent is true. Throughout the war, the Czechoslovak government in exile strongly supported Banbury's point of view. It even mailed out a newsletter issued by the Czechoslovak Government Information Service's Carpathian Russian desk, featuring an article by Banbury titled Fruits of the Berlin-Budapest Marriage, 1944. There's no question that Banbury threw his lot in with the Czechs in order to garner the post-war political changes he envisioned for Hungary. Banbury proposed his vision, a democratic Hungary and a Danubian or Balkan confederation with no leaders have been involved in the Horthy government, to U.S. Department of State in a memo headed Secret and dated 10 May 1944. In it, he proposed that the committee he founded, the Committee for a New Democratic Hungary, be utilized as a Hungarian advisory committee for the post-war governance of Hungary. This would, he said, avoid the involvement of, quote, representatives of the ruling caste who are only too ready to conform to any foreign power which happens to be in charge in the country, unquote. This memo outlines this committee's policy recommendations for post-war Hungary and states that their implementation should not be hindered as, quote, it seems probable that the Russian desire to have democratic, non-aggressive nations on her vicinity is meant seriously, unquote. After Hungary's first post-war election held in November 1945, Banbury sent the Department of State an undated memo in which he reveals his committee had to be dissolved and Hartz discontinued because Hungary had been recognized as a, quote, a truly democratic regime by the United States, unquote. Nevertheless, he goes on, those who had carried on the hard struggle against reactionary Hungarian elements in this United States feel it to be our duty to continue this struggle insofar as it seems necessary. Revealingly, the memo continues in the same way as during the war. Hungarian Americans in this country are still to a great extent supporting reactionary anti-Semitic policy. Hungarian American communists are unfortunately no antidote to this poison because in pursuance of their realistic policy, they're ready to cooperate with the arch-reactionary Hungarian American Federation. And after railing against the Hungarian American press for having stepped up its activities against his committee's point of view, Banbury gets to the point. Our request is that you may kindly grant us the usual support for the next 6 months. While there is ample documentation that the Czechoslovak government in exile provided financial support for Banbury's committee, this memo is the only primary document in which the U.S. State Department is directly identified as having been a source of funds for the Banbury organization. The Banbury papers contain a few references to financial support from Myra Travers, the same State Department official, head of the visa section, who provided secret financial support for the committee of ministers. Perhaps in its practice of political realism, the State Department was funding both exile groups. In addition to its financial support from the U.S. State Department and the Czech government in exile, circumstantial evidence also points to British support for, if not a financial connection with Banbury. This is evidenced by the British Intelligence Service, the SOE, Special Operations Executive, establishment of an anti-Eckhart anti-Hungarian publication, Igazmondó, using Ignaz Schulz as their editor. Schulz wrote openly each month for Banbury's publication Hartz, but his Igazmondó position was kept secret. Ironically, neither the mainstream Committee of Ministers, which had popular support at home and among emigre groups, nor the American Federation of Democratic Hungarians, which had little populist support, but much clout on the left and with the successor states, ended up as the dominant force in Hungary's post-war government. Both groups dwindled and eventually halted their efforts. Individual members, however, kept up the effort to influence and assist post-war Hungary. It took the harsh political reality of the Cold War for the United States to finally approve and fund the creation in 1947 of an emigre organization, the Hungarian National Council, that could be effective both at home and abroad. I thank you for your attention.